When my daughter-in-law Jessica called me an outdated relic who needs to stay in her lane, she was standing in the marble foyer of the $1.2 million Victorian mansion that I had secretly gifted to my son David 2 years earlier, a house that Jessica believed they owned outright, but that I could legally reclaim with a single phone call. Before we dive into this story, let me know where you're watching from, and if you've ever dealt with ungrateful family members, make sure you're subscribed, because what happened next will absolutely blow your mind. Here's what Jessica Martinez Walsh didn't know when she decided to humiliate a 70-year-old woman in front of her own grandchildren during what was supposed to be a peaceful Sunday dinner. I wasn't just some forgotten old lady she could dismiss and disrespect. I was Margaret Elizabeth Walsh, former senior partner at Walsh & Associates Real Estate Law, and the woman who had been quietly ensuring their entire lifestyle for the past 5 years, including every square foot of the roof over her head that she was about to lose. Let me tell you how I went from being treated like an unwelcome burden in my own son's home to the person holding the legal documents that could destroy everything they thought they owned. The confrontation that would change everything happened on a crisp October Sunday in 2023, in the grand foyer of 847 Elm Street in the prestigious Riverside Heights neighborhood of Portland, Oregon. The house, a meticulously restored 1890s Victorian with original hardwood floors, stained glass windows, and a wraparound porch that had been featured in Architectural Digest, was worth every penny of its $1.2 million price tag. What made the moment even more surreal was that I was standing in a home I had purchased with my own money, listening to a woman who had never contributed a single dollar toward its acquisition tell me that I didn't belong there. But Jessica's venomous words weren't just an insult. They were the final confirmation that the woman I had tried so hard to welcome into our family saw me as nothing more than an inconvenient obstacle to her perfect life. A life that, unbeknownst to her, I had been funding from the shadows for half a decade. The irony was so thick, you could cut it with a knife. Jessica Martinez Walsh, a 34-year-old former retail manager who had never owned property in her life, was lecturing me, a woman who had built a real estate law practice worth $4.2 million and owned properties across 3 states, about staying in my lane. She was doing this while standing on imported Italian marble that I had personally selected and paid for, underneath a custom chandelier that had cost more than most people's annual salaries, in a house that existed in her life solely because of my generosity. What made the situation even more devastating was the presence of my grandchildren during this verbal assault. 8-year-old Tommy Walsh, my son David's eldest, stood frozen by the grand staircase, his bright blue eyes wide with confusion as he watched his mother scream at his grandmother. His 6-year-old sister, Lucy, had tears streaming down her face as she clutched her favorite stuffed elephant, clearly traumatized by the violent anger in her mother's voice. These children, whom I adored more than life itself, were being forced to witness their grandmother being treated like garbage in what they believed was their family home. But they had no idea that the home they were living in, the bedrooms where they slept safely each night, the backyard playground where I had installed a custom swing set worth $15,000, the heated pool where we had spent countless summer afternoons. All of it existed because their supposedly powerless grandmother had made it possible. Jessica's attack hadn't come out of nowhere. It was the culmination of months of escalating disrespect and calculated cruelty that had been building since my beloved husband Richard's death 18 months earlier. Richard Walsh had been my law partner, my best friend, and the love of my life for 43 years. When pancreatic cancer took him in March 2022, I lost not just my husband, but my anchor, my daily companion, and the person who had always stood as a buffer between me and the more difficult aspects of family dynamics. Richard had always been better at handling Jessica's passive-aggressive comments and manipulative behavior. He had a way of deflecting her barbs with humor and redirecting conversations before they became confrontational. Maggie, he used to say, using the nickname only he was allowed to use. Some people show love differently. Jessica shows love by trying to control everything around her. We just have to be patient and consistent. But patience and consistency hadn't worked. If anything, Jessica had interpreted my continued kindness after Richard's death as weakness, and she had begun testing boundaries in ways that became increasingly brazen and hurtful. The Sunday confrontation had started innocuously enough. I had arrived at David and Jessica's house, though thinking of it as their house now felt like a cruel joke, at 2 p.m. for our traditional family dinner. This weekly gathering had been a cornerstone of our family life for over a decade, a time when 3 generations came together to maintain connections and create memories. I always brought something special: homemade cookies for the children, a bottle of wine from Richard's carefully curated collection, or flowers from my garden that I thought would brighten their dining room. That particular Sunday, I had brought a beautiful pot roast that had been slow cooking since dawn, along with my grandmother's famous dinner rolls and an apple pie made from fruit I had picked myself at a local orchard. I was excited to share the meal with my family and to hear about Tommy's recent soccer games and Lucy's progress in her piano lessons. David met me at the front door with a hug that felt slightly strained. My son, now 42 years old and a successful architect at a prominent Portland firm, had inherited his father's tall frame and thoughtful demeanor, but lately he seemed perpetually exhausted and stressed. The easy smile that had defined his personality since childhood appeared less frequently, and I had noticed that he often seemed to be walking on eggshells around his own wife. "Hi, Mom," he said, taking the heavy pot from my hands. "Everything smells amazing, as always. Jessica's in the kitchen finishing up the salad." I followed David through the grand foyer, past the living room with its restored Victorian moldings and the custom built-in bookcases I had commissioned from a local craftsman, and into the gourmet kitchen that had been completely renovated with top-of-the-line appliances and handcrafted cabinetry. The kitchen renovation alone had cost $85,000, every penny of which had come from my accounts, though Jessica had spent months researching and selecting every detail as if she were spending her own money. Jessica looked up from the marble island, where she was assembling what appeared to be a simple green salad, nothing that required the level of concentration her furrowed brow suggested. At 34, Jessica remained conventionally attractive in the way that required constant maintenance. Perfectly highlighted blonde hair, flawless makeup even for casual family dinners, and a wardrobe that seemed to consist entirely of expensive athleisure, wear that showcased her dedication to boutique fitness classes. "Margaret," she said without smiling, using my formal name despite years of my encouraging her to call me Mom, or at least Maggie. "I hope you didn't go overboard with the cooking again. We're trying to teach the children about moderation and healthy eating habits." The criticism stung, as it was intended to. Jessica had a talent for finding ways to diminish my contributions, while positioning herself as the superior parent and household manager. My pot roast, made with lean beef and fresh vegetables, was hardly an indulgent meal, but Jessica had a way of framing my cooking as somehow harmful or excessive. "It's just a family dinner, Jessica," I replied mildly, determined not to let her negativity spoil the afternoon. "The children always enjoy when we have a special meal together." "The children enjoy a lot of things that aren't necessarily good. For them," Jessica said, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. "Part of being a responsible parent is setting boundaries and teaching discipline, not just giving them whatever makes them happy in the moment." The implication was clear. I was an irresponsible grandmother who spoiled the children, while she was the thoughtful parent who made the hard but necessary decisions about their well-being. It was a dynamic that had been developing for months, with Jessica positioning herself as the family's moral authority while treating me like an interfering outsider. David, who had been unpacking my contributions to dinner, looked up with obvious discomfort. "Jess, Mom's just trying to do something nice for the family. Maybe we could save the parenting philosophy discussion for later?" Jessica's eyes flashed with anger at what she clearly interpreted as David taking my side against her. "I think it's Interesting that your mother's feelings matter more to you than your children's health and development. But I suppose that's been the dynamic in this family for a long time. Your mother, not Mom or even Margaret, but your mother, as if I were some external threat to their family unit rather than David's parent and the children's grandmother. The language was deliberate and designed to create distance and otherness. Before David could respond, Tommy and Lucy came bounding into the kitchen, their faces lighting up when they saw me. "Grandma Maggie!" Lucy squealed, throwing her arms around my waist with the uncomplicated affection that only young children can provide. "Did you bring us anything special?" "I might have something for you after dinner," I said, hugging her tight and breathing in the strawberry scent of her shampoo. "But first, tell me about your week. How was school?" As the children chattered, excitedly about their classes, their friends, and their upcoming Halloween costumes, I noticed Jessica watching our interaction with what could only be described as resentment. For reasons I couldn't fully understand, my relationship with Tommy and Lucy seemed to irritate her, as if their affection for me somehow diminished her role in their lives. The dinner itself proceeded with the kind of forced civility that had become our family's default mode. David attempted to maintain conversation about neutral topics, work projects, neighborhood news, upcoming holidays, while Jessica offered minimal participation, and I tried to engage the children without appearing to undermine their mother's authority. But the tension was building throughout the meal, fueled by small comments and subtle digs that Jessica delivered with surgical precision. When Tommy asked for a second helping of my pot roast, Jessica commented that he needed to learn portion control. When Lucy complimented my dinner rolls, Jessica mentioned that refined carbs weren't part of their usual meal planning. When I offered to help clean up, Jessica insisted that they had a specific system that worked better when outside people didn't interfere. Outside people. I was being categorized as an outsider in a home that I owned, serving food that I had prepared to grandchildren I had helped raise since birth. The breaking point came when Lucy, who had been quieter than usual throughout dinner, suddenly burst into tears over what seemed like nothing. David had simply asked her to finish her vegetables before leaving the table. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" I asked, reaching over to comfort her. "Don't coddle her," Jessica snapped. "Lucy needs to learn that crying doesn't get her out of responsibilities. This is exactly the kind of enabling behavior that creates problems." I felt my temper flare, but kept my voice calm. "She's 6 years old, Jessica. Sometimes children just need comfort and understanding." "She's 6 years old and perfectly capable of managing her emotions without having every adult in the room rush to rescue her from basic expectations," Jessica shot back. "But I guess some people think that being a grandparent means you get to undermine the actual parents and confuse the children about boundaries." Some people. The phrase hung in the air like a challenge. David looked mortified. Tommy had stopped eating entirely, and Lucy's tears were flowing harder now, though whether from the original issue or the tension filling the room was unclear. "I think we're all a little tired," David said desperately. "Maybe we should—" "No, David," Jessica interrupted, her voice rising. "I think it's time we had an honest conversation about some issues that have been building up in this family." She stood up from the dining table and walked into the foyer, clearly expecting the rest of us to follow. David shot me an apologetic look as he gathered the children, and we all moved into the grand entryway of the house, the space with soaring ceilings, original stained glass, and architectural details that had taken months to restore. "Margaret," Jessica began, her voice taking on the tone of someone delivering a prepared speech, "I think we need to establish some clearer boundaries about your role in our family and our household." Our household. The possessive language was breathtaking in its audacity. "I appreciate that you want to be involved with the children," she continued. "But David and I are their parents, and we need to make decisions about their upbringing without constant interference and second-guessing from people who aren't part of the daily realities of raising them. People who aren't part of the daily realities. I had been babysitting Tommy and Lucy since they were infants. I had been the one David called when they needed emergency childcare, when the children were sick and Jessica couldn't miss work, when they wanted to take a weekend trip and needed someone trustworthy to watch the kids. I had been part of their daily realities since before Jessica had even been pregnant. Jessica, I said carefully, I've never tried to undermine your parenting. I love those children, and I just want to be a supportive grandmother. Supportive would be respecting our decisions and following our lead instead of constantly providing alternative opinions and confusing the children about expectations. Jessica replied. Tommy and Lucy need consistency, not mixed messages from adults who think they know better than their actual parents. Adults who think they know better. The disrespect was becoming more blatant with each sentence. David finally found his voice. Jess, I think you're being unfair. Mom has always been respectful of our parenting choices. Has she? Jessica whirled on her husband. Because from where I stand, it looks like every time I try to set a boundary or establish a rule, your mother is right there offering comfort and alternative approaches that make me look like the bad guy to my own children. My own children. Not our children, but my children, as if David's relationship with them was somehow secondary to hers. That's not what I'm doing, I said, feeling my composure starting to crack. I'm just trying to love my grandchildren. Love doesn't mean giving them whatever they want and rescuing them from every minor disappointment, Jessica shot back. Love means preparing them for the real world, teaching them resilience, helping them understand that they can't manipulate their way out of responsibilities by turning on the waterworks. She was talking about Lucy's tears at dinner as if they were calculated manipulation rather than the normal emotional responses of a 6-year-old child. They're children, Jessica, I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. They're supposed to be able to express their feelings and receive comfort from the adults who love them. They're my children, Jessica said, her voice becoming shrill. And I will decide what kind of comfort and support they receive. I don't need parenting advice from someone whose own child... She stopped abruptly, but the implication was clear. Someone whose own child. She was about to criticize my parenting of David, suggesting that any problems in his life were the result of my failures as a mother. The attack was becoming personal in ways that crossed every line of decency and respect. That's when she delivered the words that would change everything. You know what, Margaret? I think the real problem here is that you can't accept that your time as the central figure in this family is over. You're an outdated relic who needs to stay in her lane and let the people who actually live in this house make decisions about how this house is run. An outdated relic who needs to stay in her lane. The words hit me like a physical blow. I stood there in the foyer of the house I owned, looking at the stained glass windows I had restored, surrounded by the architectural details I had lovingly preserved, listening to a woman who had never owned so much as a studio apartment tell me that I needed to stay in my lane. This house. The house that Jessica was claiming as hers. The house where she was telling me I didn't belong. The house that existed in her life solely because of my generosity. Generosity that she was now using as a platform to humiliate and belittle me in front of my own family. The silence that followed her words was deafening. Tommy and Lucy stood frozen by the staircase, clearly understanding that something terrible had just happened, even if they couldn't fully comprehend the adult dynamics at play. David's face had gone pale, and he looked like he was about to be sick. Jessica, he said quietly, that was completely out of line. Was it? She snapped. Because I'm tired of pretending that this dynamic is healthy for anyone, especially the children. They need to understand family hierarchy and respect. Boundaries, not watch their grandmother constantly challenge their mother's authority. Family hierarchy, respect boundaries. She was using therapeutic language to justify cruelty, wrapping abuse in the language of healthy family dynamics. As I stood there, absorbing the full impact of what had just happened, I realized that this moment was the culmination of years of careful manipulation and systematic disrespect. Jessica hadn't just lost her temper. She had revealed exactly how she viewed me and my place in this family. I wasn't a beloved grandmother or a respected family elder. I was an obstacle to be managed, a relic to be tolerated until I could be fully marginalized. But what Jessica didn't know, as she stood there in her righteous anger, was that the outdated relic she was dismissing had legal documents in her home office that could strip away everything Jessica thought she owned. The house, the lifestyle, the financial security she took for granted. All of it could disappear with a single phone call to my attorney. More importantly, I realized that this moment wasn't just about Jessica's disrespect. It was about a pattern of exploitation that had been hidden under the guise of family love and generosity. For 5 years, I had been funding a lifestyle that enabled Jessica to treat me as disposable while enjoying the fruits of my labor and sacrifice. As I looked around the foyer, at the crown molding I had insisted be restored to original specifications, at the custom millwork that had required finding craftsmen who specialized in Victorian-era techniques, at the imported tile that had taken 6 months to source and install, I felt something shift inside me that was more powerful than hurt or anger. I felt clarity. The woman who thought she could dismiss me as an outdated relic was about to learn exactly what this particular relic was capable of, and the lesson was going to cost her everything she thought she owned. But first, I needed to get out of that house before I said something that would tip my hand. The strategic response I was already planning would require careful preparation and legal precision. Jessica had just made the biggest mistake of her entitled life, but she wouldn't understand the consequences until it was far too late to apologize. As I gathered my purse and coat, ignoring David's desperate attempts to smooth things over and Jessica's continued rant about boundaries and respect, I realized that this moment was going to be the turning point for our entire family. The relic was about to remind everyone exactly who held the real power. And Jessica. Martinez Walsh was about to learn that underestimating a woman who had built a legal empire was the most expensive mistake she could possibly make. To understand how I ended up standing in my own foyer being called an outdated relic by a woman who had never owned property in her life, you need to know who Margaret Elizabeth Walsh was before she became the target of her daughter-in-law's calculated cruelty. Because the woman Jessica thought she could dismiss and disrespect wasn't just some lonely widow clinging to past relevance. I was someone who had built an empire from nothing, survived devastating losses, and learned that sometimes the greatest act of love is knowing when to stop enabling someone else's selfishness. My story begins in 1953, when I was born Margaret Elizabeth Murphy in a 2-bedroom apartment above Murphy's hardware store in the small logging town of Timber Falls, Oregon. My father, Patrick Murphy, was a 3rd-generation Irish immigrant who had inherited the hardware store from his father and ran it with the kind of meticulous attention to detail that made him the most trusted businessman in a community where your word was your bond. My mother, Rose Murphy, was a schoolteacher who believed that education was the only thing that could lift a person above their circumstances, and that intelligence, once developed, could never be taken away from you. The Murphy family wasn't wealthy by any stretch of the imagination, but we were rich in values that would shape every decision I would make for the next 70 years. Hard work wasn't just expected, it was a form of worship, a way of honoring the opportunities that previous generations had sacrificed to provide. Integrity wasn't something you practiced when it was convenient. It was the foundation of your character, especially when maintaining it cost you something valuable. Family loyalty wasn't conditional on how people treated you. It was a commitment you made that endured through disappointment, disagreement, and even betrayal. But perhaps most importantly, my parents taught me that true strength wasn't about dominating others or demanding recognition. It was about quietly ensuring that the people you loved had opportunities to thrive, even when they never knew that your sacrifices had made their success possible. Growing up in Timber Falls during the 1950s and 1960s meant understanding that opportunities were limited, especially for women who had ambitions beyond marriage and motherhood. The town had exactly one lawyer, one doctor, one dentist, and a handful of businesses that had been run by the same families for generations. Most girls my age assumed they would marry local boys, raise children, and spend their lives within a 20-mile radius of where they were born. But my mother had different plans for me. Rose Murphy had graduated from Oregon State University in 1948 with a degree in English literature, an almost unheard-of achievement for a woman from her background, and she was determined that her daughter would have educational opportunities that extended far beyond the limitations of small-town life. "Margaret Elizabeth," she would say as we sat at our kitchen table each evening, working through homework assignments that she had supplemented with additional reading and math problems. "Intelligence is the only thing that can never be taken away from you. Money can be lost, houses can burn down, husbands can leave or die, but what you put in your mind becomes part of who you are forever." My mother's words proved prophetic in ways that neither of us could have anticipated when I was a gangly 12-year-old struggling with algebra and dreaming of adventures beyond Timber Falls. I was an excellent student, but more than that, I was a strategic thinker who understood that academic achievement was my ticket to a larger world. By high school, I was class valedictorian, editor of the school newspaper, and the first student in Timber Falls High School history to be accepted to Stanford University with a full academic scholarship. The day I received my acceptance letter, in the spring of 1971, my father closed the hardware store early, and my mother cried tears of joy and pride that I can still remember 43 years later. We celebrated at Henderson's Diner, the fanciest restaurant in town, and I felt like I was embarking on a journey that would transform not just my life, but the possibilities for future generations of Murphy women. Stanford in the early 1970s was a revelation. I had never been surrounded by so many brilliant, ambitious people who assumed that intelligence should be developed and used to make meaningful contributions to society. For the first time in my life, being smart wasn't something that made me different or threatening. It was simply the baseline expectation for participation in academic and social life. I majored in political science with a concentration in law and public policy, planning to attend law school and eventually work in government or public interest law. The legal profession was just beginning to open up opportunities for women, and I wanted to be part of the generation that would break down barriers and create paths for the women who would follow. It was during my junior year at Stanford that I met Richard James Walsh at a pre-law society meeting where he was giving a presentation about real estate law as a career path. Richard was a third-year law student at Stanford Law School, 3 years older than me, with dark hair, intelligent brown eyes, and a quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly what he wanted to accomplish in life. But what struck me most about Richard wasn't his obvious intelligence or his undeniable good looks. It was his integrity and his vision for using legal expertise to help ordinary people navigate complex systems that often seemed designed to exploit those who couldn't afford sophisticated representation. Real estate law might not be as glamorous as criminal defense or corporate litigation, Richard told the audience of ambitious undergraduates, but it's where ordinary families make the biggest financial decisions of their lives. Buying a home, understanding mortgage terms, dealing with property disputes. These are the legal issues that affect people's daily lives and long-term financial security. After his presentation, I approached Richard with questions about how real estate law could be used to help low-income families avoid predatory lending practices and discriminatory housing policies. Our conversation lasted 3 hours, moving from the lecture hall to a coffee shop to a long walk around campus. And by the end of the evening, I knew that I had met someone who shared my values and my commitment to using professional success as a platform for helping others. Richard and I began dating seriously during my senior year, and by the time I graduated from Stanford in 1975, we had already begun planning a future together that would combine our professional ambitions with our shared commitment to building a family based on love, integrity, and service to others. We were married in the summer of 1976 in a ceremony at St. Mary's Catholic Church in Timber Falls, with a reception at the community center that brought together Richard's sophisticated San Francisco family and my working-class Oregon relatives. The guest list included Stanford professors, law school classmates, and the people who had shaped my childhood, hardware store customers, my high school teachers, and neighbors who had watched me grow up and were proud to see one of their own achieve something extraordinary. By that time, I had completed my first year at Stanford Law School, where I was in the top 10% of my class and serving as an editor on the Stanford Law Review. Richard had graduated and been offered positions at several prestigious San Francisco law firms, but he had decided to start his own practice specializing in real estate law for middle-class families who needed sophisticated legal representation at affordable prices. The decision to start his own firm rather than join an established practice was risky, but it reflected the values that had drawn me to Richard in the first place. He could have made significantly more money working for a corporate firm, but he was more interested in building something meaningful than in maximizing his income. "Maggie," he said one evening as we walked through Golden Gate Park, discussing our plans for after my law school graduation, "I want us to build a practice that helps families achieve their dreams of home ownership while ensuring they understand exactly what they're signing and what their rights are. I want to be the lawyer that people trust with the biggest financial decision of their lives." I graduated from Stanford Law School in 1978, passing the California bar exam on my first attempt and joining Richard's practice as an associate attorney. Walsh & Associates, the name we chose to reflect our partnership both professionally and personally, began as a two-person operation working out of a small office in downtown San Rafael, serving clients throughout Marin County and the North Bay. Our practice grew steadily throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s, built on a reputation for thorough, honest legal representation that helped families navigate the complexities of real estate transactions without being overwhelmed by legal jargon or hidden costs. We handled everything from first-time home purchases to complex commercial real estate deals, but our specialty was working with middle-class families who needed sophisticated legal advice at prices they could afford. What made Walsh & Associates unique in the real estate law field was our commitment to client education. We didn't just handle the legal paperwork. We made sure our clients understood every aspect of their transactions, from mortgage terms to property rights to potential future risks. Richard and I spent hours with each client, explaining not just what they were signing, but why those provisions mattered and how they could protect their interests. This approach required more time and effort than the standard practice of rushing clients through standardized paperwork, but it created a level of trust and loyalty that generated decades of referrals and repeat business. Families who bought their first homes with our help came back to us when they needed to sell or purchase larger properties. Young couples we had helped in the 1980s brought their adult children to us in the 2000s when those children were ready to buy their own homes. By the mid-1980s, Walsh & Associates had grown to include 4 associate attorneys and a support staff of 6, with offices in San Rafael, Santa Rosa, and Petaluma. We were handling over 500 real estate transactions per year and had developed a reputation as the most trusted real estate law firm in the North Bay. But professional success, while satisfying, wasn't the most important part of our life together. Richard and I had always planned to have children, and we spent our early married years assuming that pregnancy would happen naturally when we were ready to start a family. After 3 years of marriage, we began actively trying to conceive. When pregnancy didn't occur within the first year, we sought medical advice and began the emotionally exhausting process of fertility testing and treatment that would define the next 8 years of our lives. The fertility struggle was devastating, in ways that people who haven't experienced it can't fully understand. Every month brought hope followed by disappointment. Every medical appointment brought new possibilities followed by more setbacks. Every friend's pregnancy announcement, every baby shower invitation, every family gathering where relatives asked when we were going to have children, became a reminder of the family we desperately wanted but couldn't seem to create. Richard and I went through multiple rounds of fertility treatments, including 2 attempts at in vitro fertilization that ended in miscarriage. We consulted specialists in San Francisco, Los Angeles, and even traveled to a fertility clinic in Boston that was pioneering new treatment protocols. We spent over $80,000 on medical treatments and procedures, exhausting our savings and borrowing, against our home equity to fund increasingly experimental approaches. But perhaps more challenging than the financial cost was the emotional toll. The fertility struggle tested our marriage in ways that we hadn't anticipated, creating cycles of hope and disappointment that were difficult to navigate while maintaining our professional responsibilities and social relationships. There were moments when I wondered if we should accept that biological parenthood wasn't meant to be part of our story and focus on adoption or other ways of building a family. There were other moments when Richard wondered if we were being selfish and pursuing parenthood so aggressively when we already had a fulfilling marriage and successful careers. But we persevered, partly because we couldn't imagine our lives without children, and partly because we had built our entire future around the assumption that we would be parents. The practice we were building, the financial security we were creating, the values we were developing, all of it was oriented toward providing a foundation for the family we intended to raise. When I finally became pregnant in the spring of 1986, at age 33 after 8 years of trying, the joy was almost overwhelming, but the pregnancy was complicated from the beginning, requiring bed rest for the final 4 months, and culminating in an emergency cesarean section that nearly cost both David and me our lives. David Murphy Walsh was born on October 15, 1986, weighing 5 pounds, 3 ounces, and requiring a 3-week stay in the neonatal intensive care unit. But he was perfect, absolutely, completely perfect, with Richard's dark hair and thoughtful expression and what the nurses said was an unusually alert and curious gaze for such a young baby. Holding David for the first time, after 8 years of hoping and disappointment, I understood what my mother had meant about certain things becoming part of who you are forever. The love I felt for that tiny, fragile baby wasn't just an emotion, it was a fundamental transformation of my identity and priorities that would influence every decision I made for the rest of my life. Richard was an extraordinary father from the moment David came home from the hospital. He approached parenting with the same thoughtful preparation and commitment to excellence that he brought to everything else in his life, reading books about child development, consulting with pediatricians about nutrition and safety, and ensuring that David's nursery was perfectly designed for both comfort and stimulation. But more than that, Richard understood that David represented not just our personal joy, but our responsibility to raise a person who would contribute positively to the world. From David's earliest years, Richard emphasized the importance of integrity, compassion, and using whatever privileges and opportunities you were given to help others who had fewer advantages. David, Richard would say as our son grew from toddler to child to teenager, your mother and I have worked hard to provide you with opportunities that not every child has. Education, travel, cultural experiences, financial security, these things come with responsibilities. You need to use your advantages to make the world better for people who haven't had the same opportunities. David absorbed these lessons naturally, growing into a thoughtful, compassionate young man who excelled academically and socially while maintaining the kind of humility and consideration for others that made him genuinely liked by his peers and respected by his teachers. Throughout David's childhood and adolescence, Walsh & Associates continued to grow and prosper. By the 1990s, we had expanded to include 12 attorneys and were handling real estate transactions throughout Northern California. We had also begun investing in real estate ourselves, purchasing and renovating properties that we either sold for profit or kept as rental investments. The real estate investments were Richard's idea. born from his observation that many of our clients built long-term wealth through property ownership, while most attorneys built wealth through income that disappeared the moment they stopped working. "Maggie," he said one evening as we reviewed our financial portfolio, "we're helping our clients build wealth through real estate investment, but we're not following our own advice. We should be using our knowledge and professional connections to build a real estate portfolio that will provide financial security long after we retire from active practice." Richard's instincts were exceptional. Between 1990 and 2005, we purchased and renovated over 20 properties throughout Northern California, from single-family homes in developing neighborhoods to small apartment buildings in areas that were gentrifying. Our investment strategy was conservative but consistent. Purchase undervalued properties in areas with good long-term prospects, renovate them to high standards, and either sell them for profit or hold them as rental properties that generated steady income. By 2005, our real estate portfolio was worth over $3 million, generating monthly rental income of nearly $15,000 while continuing to appreciate in value. Combined with the success of Walsh & Associates and our conservative approach to saving and investing, we had built a level of financial security that exceeded our wildest dreams when we were young attorneys struggling to build a practice and start a family. But financial success, while providing peace of mind and opportunities, was never the primary focus of our lives. Our greatest joy was watching David grow into the kind of man who would make us proud, not because of his achievements, but because of his character. David excelled at everything he touched: academics, athletics, music, social relationships. But more importantly, he maintained the kind of humility and consideration for others that suggested he understood the responsibilities that came with his advantages. He was student body president in high school, captain of the soccer team, and valedictorian of his graduating class, but he was also the kind of young man who made sure that less popular classmates felt included and who spent his summers volunteering at a camp for children with disabilities. When David was accepted to the University of California at Berkeley with a full academic scholarship, Richard and I felt the same pride that my parents had experienced when I was accepted to Stanford 30 years earlier. We were watching our son prepare to build on the foundation we had provided, while developing his own vision for how to use his talents and opportunities to make meaningful contributions to the world. David majored in architecture with a minor in environmental studies, planning to specialize in sustainable design and affordable housing. His senior thesis project was a proposal for environmentally responsible low-income housing that could be built cost-effectively in urban areas, combining his technical training with his commitment to social justice. "Mom, Dad," he said during a family dinner in his senior year, "I want to use architecture to help solve problems for people who don't have a lot of resources. There's so much beautiful, thoughtful design that only wealthy people get to experience. I want to figure out how to make good design accessible to families who are just trying to find decent, affordable places to live." Richard and I exchanged glances across the dinner table, recognizing in David's words the same values that had guided our own career choices 30 years earlier. We had succeeded in raising a son who understood that privilege came with responsibility, and who wanted to use his professional skills to help others rather than simply to maximize his own success. After graduating from UC Berkeley, David was accepted to the Graduate Architecture program at Portland State University, where he could specialize in sustainable design while working with a professor who was nationally recognized for innovative approaches to affordable housing. It was in Portland that David met Jessica Martinez during his second year of graduate school. Jessica was working as an assistant manager at an upscale retail boutique in downtown Portland while taking evening classes in business administration at Portland Community College. She was beautiful, charming, and clearly intelligent, with ambitions for a career in retail management, or possibly opening her own business. When David brought Jessica home to meet us during Thanksgiving of his second year in graduate school, Richard and I could immediately see why our son was so taken with her. Jessica was vivacious and engaging, asking thoughtful questions about our law practice and expressing genuine interest in David's architecture projects and career plans. "Mr. and Mrs. Walsh," she said as I served coffee and dessert after Thanksgiving. "Dinner?" "David has told me so much about how you built your practice by focusing on helping families rather than just maximizing profits. That's such an inspiring approach to professional success." She seemed to understand and appreciate the values that were important to our family, and more importantly, she clearly adored David and supported his professional ambitions. Throughout the weekend, I watched Jessica encourage David to talk about his architecture projects, offer thoughtful feedback on his design ideas, and express enthusiasm for his plans to specialize in affordable housing. Richard and I were impressed by Jessica's intelligence and charm, but we were even more impressed by the way she seemed to bring out the best in David. Our son, who had always been somewhat serious and introspective, laughed more easily and spoke more confidently about his dreams and plans when Jessica was around. When David called 6 months later to tell us that he and Jessica were engaged, Richard and I were genuinely happy for them. They seemed like a couple who shared values and ambitions, who supported each other's goals, and who were building a relationship based on mutual respect and affection. The wedding, held in Portland in the summer of 2009, was a beautiful celebration that brought together David's academic friends, Jessica's family from Los Angeles, and our extended network of legal and business colleagues. Jessica looked radiant in her wedding dress. David was clearly ecstatic, and the ceremony reflected their shared commitment to building a life together based on love, integrity, and service to others. Richard and I contributed $50,000 toward the wedding expenses, and we also gave David and Jessica a down payment of $100,000 toward their first home as a wedding gift. We wanted to help them start their marriage with financial security and the kind of stable foundation that would allow them to focus on their careers and relationship without the stress of overwhelming financial obligations. The first few years of David and Jessica's marriage seemed idyllic. David joined a respected architecture firm in Portland that specialized in sustainable design and community development projects. Jessica was promoted to store manager at her boutique and was taking additional business courses with plans to eventually open her own fashion retail business. They purchased a charming craftsman-style house in the Hawthorne neighborhood, close to David's office and in a community of young professionals who shared their interests in environmental sustainability and social responsibility. The house needed some renovation work, which David approached as an opportunity to practice sustainable design principles while creating a home that reflected their personal style and values. Richard and I visited Portland regularly during those early years, helping with renovation projects, babysitting when Tommy was born in 2011, and watching our son and daughter-in-law build the kind of life that we had always hoped David would create. Jessica seemed to be thriving in her role as wife and new mother. She was loving and attentive with Tommy, supportive of David's career advancement, and actively involved in their neighborhood community. She organized playgroups for new mothers, volunteered with environmental organizations that David supported, and appeared to be building genuine friendships with other young families in their area. When Lucy was born in 2013, completing their family with 2 healthy, beautiful children, Richard and I felt like we were watching our deepest dreams come to fruition. David was succeeding professionally while maintaining his commitment to meaningful work. Jessica was balancing motherhood with her own career ambitions. Tommy and Lucy were thriving in an environment of love, stability, and opportunity. Looking back now, I realized that the early signs of Jessica's true character were present even during those seemingly happy years. But they were subtle enough that Richard and I attributed them to the normal stresses of new parenthood and career building, rather than to fundamental character flaws. Jessica had always been somewhat materialistic, but during the early years of their marriage, her focus on designer clothes, expensive home furnishings, and luxury experiences seemed like harmless preferences rather than compulsive needs. David's income as a junior architect was modest, but Jessica's retail management position provided additional income, and they seemed to be managing their finances responsibly. But gradually, I began to notice that Jessica's lifestyle expectations were expanding faster than their income. The modest craftsman house that had seemed perfect for a young family was suddenly inadequate, too small, in an insufficiently prestigious neighborhood, lacking the kind of architectural details that would impress Jessica's increasingly affluent social circle. Jessica began making comments about friends who had moved to larger homes in more expensive neighborhoods, about the private schools that successful families chose for their children, about the vacation destinations and cultural activities that were standard among Portland's professional class. "David," I heard her say during one of our visits, "I just think we need to be strategic about building the kind of life that will provide opportunities for Tommy and Lucy. The neighborhood we're in now is fine for a starter home, but we want the children to grow up with advantages and connections that will serve them well as they get older." The language was careful and reasonable, framed in terms of providing opportunities for the children rather than satisfying Jessica's personal ambitions. But I recognized the underlying message. The life that David's income could provide wasn't sufficient for Jessica's vision of what their family deserved. When Richard was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in January 2020, everything in our family's life shifted into crisis mode. The diagnosis was devastating. Pancreatic cancer has one of the worst prognosis rates of any cancer, and Richard's case was already advanced when it was discovered during what was supposed to be a routine physical examination. The 2 years between Richard's diagnosis and his death in March 2022 were a blur of medical appointments, treatments, hospitalizations, and the gradual realization that we were fighting a battle we were unlikely to win. Richard faced his illness with the same courage and grace that had characterized every other challenge in his life, but watching cancer slowly destroy the man I had loved for over 40 years was the most difficult experience of my life. During Richard's illness, David and Jessica were supportive in ways that meant everything to us. They visited regularly, helped coordinate medical appointments, and ensured that Tommy and Lucy could spend time with their grandfather despite the challenges of his treatment schedule. Jessica, in particular, seemed to understand the gravity of the situation and made genuine efforts to help however she could. When Richard died in March 2022, I thought I had lost the most important relationship of my life. But what I didn't anticipate was how much Richard's death would change the dynamics of my relationship with David and Jessica. Within months of Richard's funeral, I began to notice subtle changes in how Jessica treated me. The warm, supportive interactions during Richard's illness were replaced by interactions that felt more distant and transactional. Phone calls became less frequent and more superficial. Invitations to family gatherings became less common and more conditional. Most concerning of all, I began to feel like Jessica was actively working to limit my time with Tommy and Lucy, using scheduling conflicts and parenting decisions to reduce my involvement in their daily lives. But I attributed these changes to grief and adjustment rather than to any deliberate strategy on Jessica's part. Losing Richard had left me emotionally vulnerable and uncertain about my place in the world. I assumed that the changes I was observing in family relationships were temporary difficulties that would resolve themselves as we all adjusted to our new reality. What I didn't understand was that Richard's death had fundamentally altered the power dynamics in our family, removing the person who had always served as a buffer between Jessica's more difficult personality traits and my increasingly vulnerable position as an elderly widow. The woman who would eventually call me an outdated relic was already calculating how to exploit my grief and isolation for her own benefit. But she had made one crucial miscalculation. She assumed that a 70-year-old widow would be easy to manipulate and control. She was about to discover exactly how wrong that assumption was. The Margaret Walsh who had built a real estate empire from nothing, who had survived infertility and loss, who had raised a son with integrity and compassion, wasn't going to be dismissed or discarded by someone who had never earned a fraction of what she had achieved. The foundation of my character had been built over 70 years of challenges, successes, and hard-earned wisdom. Jessica Martinez Walsh was about to learn that attacking that foundation was the biggest mistake of her entitled life. Richard's death on March 18, 2022, didn't just end my 43-year marriage, it fundamentally altered every relationship in my life and created vulnerabilities that I didn't recognize until it was almost too late. The woman who had spent decades as half of a powerful partnership suddenly found herself navigating family dynamics, financial decisions, and social situations as a single person for the first time since she was 23 years old. What I didn't understand was how quickly grief and isolation could transform a position of strength into an opportunity for exploitation by people who were supposed to love and protect me. The immediate aftermath of Richard's death was a blur of funeral arrangements, legal procedures, and the overwhelming logistics of dismantling a shared life that had been built over 4 decades. As Richard's law partner and wife, I had always been actively involved in our business affairs, but there were still countless details that required my attention during a time when grief made it difficult to focus on practical matters. Patricia Morrison, our estate planning attorney and longtime friend, handled most of the legal complexities of settling Richard's estate. Since we had structured our assets carefully over the years, the transition was relatively straightforward from a legal standpoint. Everything transferred to me without probate complications, tax penalties, or disputes with creditors or other family members. But the emotional complexity of inheriting complete control over assets that had always been managed as part of a partnership was overwhelming. Richard and I had made every major financial decision together, debating investment strategies, evaluating real estate opportunities, and planning for retirement as a team. Suddenly, I was responsible for managing a portfolio worth over $4.2 million, while dealing with grief that made it difficult to concentrate on anything beyond basic daily survival. The real estate investments that had been our pride and joy, 23 properties throughout Northern California that generated substantial monthly income, now felt like an enormous responsibility rather than an achievement. Each property required maintenance, tenant management, and ongoing evaluation of whether to hold or sell. Every decision that had once been shared was now mine alone to make. Walsh & Associates, the law practice that Richard and I had built together, required even more immediate attention. Although we had been gradually transitioning toward retirement and had capable associate attorneys handling most of the daily operations, the firm still required leadership and strategic direction that I wasn't sure I could provide while processing my grief. During the first month after Richard's funeral, I felt like I was drowning in responsibilities that I had never fully shouldered alone. The phone rang constantly with condolence calls, business questions, tenant issues, and family obligations. Well-meaning friends offered advice about everything from grief counseling to financial planning to how quickly I should make major life changes. Everyone had opinions about what I should do, but no one could make the decisions for me. It was during this vulnerable period that David and Jessica stepped in with offers of help and support that felt like lifelines to a woman who was struggling to manage overwhelming responsibilities while processing devastating loss. "Mom," David said during one of his daily check-in phone calls about 3 weeks after the funeral, "Jessica and I have been talking, and we're worried about you trying to handle everything by yourself. You don't have to carry all these burdens alone. We're family, and we want to help however we can." The offer felt like a blessing. David had always been thoughtful and responsible, and his architectural training gave him relevant expertise for evaluating our real estate investments. Jessica, with her business background and organizational skills, seemed capable of helping with the administrative tasks that were overwhelming me. "What kind of help were you thinking about?" I asked, grateful for the first time in weeks to feel like someone understood the scope of what I was dealing with. "Well," David said carefully, "Jessica has experience with business management and financial organization from her retail work. She could help you sort through Dad's paperwork, organize the property files, maybe even assist with some of the tenant communications that you're finding stressful. Jessica's voice came on the line. They were calling together, which had become their new pattern since Richard's death. Margaret, I know this is such a difficult time for you, and I want you to know that David and I are committed to making sure you don't have to face these challenges alone. I've actually been doing some research about property management systems and organizational strategies that might help streamline some of the administrative work that's overwhelming you right now. The kindness in her voice, combined with the practical nature of her suggestions, made me feel genuinely grateful for their support. For the first time since Richard's death, I felt like I wasn't completely alone with responsibilities that felt too large for one person to handle. Over the following weeks, David and Jessica began visiting more frequently, initially just to provide emotional support, but gradually taking on more practical assistance with the business and property management, tasks that I was struggling to organize. Jessica proved to be exceptionally good at administrative organization. She created filing systems for property documents, set up spreadsheets to track rental income and expenses, and established schedules for maintenance and tenant communications that reduced the daily chaos I had been experiencing. Margaret, she said one afternoon as we worked together in Richard's home office, organizing decades of business files, you and Richard built something really incredible here. The real estate portfolio is so well structured, and the law practice has such a solid reputation. You should be proud of what you've accomplished together. Her praise felt healing during a time when I was questioning my ability to maintain what Richard and I had built. Jessica seemed to genuinely appreciate the magnitude of our achievements and the complexity of managing such extensive business interests. But more than her practical help, Jessica provided emotional support that I desperately needed. She listened. When I wanted to talk about Richard, looked at photo albums with me, and seemed to understand that grief isn't something that follows a predictable timeline or responds to well-meaning advice about moving on. You know, Margaret, she said one evening as we sat in my living room after David had gone home and she had stayed to help me organize some legal documents, I think Richard would be so proud of how you're handling all of this. It's clear that he prepared you well to manage these responsibilities, and you're stronger than you probably realize right now. The validation meant everything to me during a period when I felt uncertain about nearly every decision I was making. Jessica seemed to see strength in me that I wasn't seeing in myself, and her confidence helped me begin to believe that I could successfully manage the business and property interests that Richard and I had built together. As spring turned to summer in 2022, David and Jessica's involvement in my affairs became more extensive and more necessary. The initial organizational help evolved into regular assistance with property management, tenant relations, and business decisions that I found difficult to make alone. Jessica suggested that I might benefit from having more structured support, rather than trying to handle everything myself with occasional help from family members. Margaret, I've been thinking about your situation, and I wonder if it might make sense for us to formalize some of the assistance we've been providing, she said during one of our regular meetings in Richard's office. You're managing a significant portfolio of properties and business interests, and while you're certainly capable of handling everything yourself, you might find it less stressful to have consistent help with the day-to-day administrative tasks. The suggestion made practical sense. Property management was time-consuming and often stressful, involving tenant complaints, maintenance emergencies, and ongoing evaluation of rental rates and market conditions. Having reliable assistance would free me to focus on the larger strategic decisions about the portfolio while ensuring that daily operations continued smoothly. What kind of formal arrangement were you thinking about? I asked. Well, David and I could establish a property management company that would handle all the administrative details for your real estate investments, Jessica explained. You would retain complete ownership and control over all the properties, but we would manage tenant relations, maintenance coordination, rent collection, and monthly financial reporting. It would be a professional arrangement that would provide you with reliable support while allowing us to help you maintain and grow the portfolio that you and Richard built. The proposal seemed reasonable and beneficial for everyone involved. I would receive professional property management services from people I trusted, while David and Jessica would earn income from providing those services. Most importantly, it would allow me to maintain our family's financial success while reducing the daily stress that had been overwhelming me since Richard's death. We agreed that David and Jessica would establish Walsh Property Management LLC, with a management fee of 8% of gross rental income, a rate that was competitive with other professional property management companies in the area. They would handle all aspects of day-to-day property operations while providing me with monthly financial reports and consulting with me on major decisions about renovations, tenant issues, or potential property sales. The arrangement worked well initially. David and Jessica proved to be competent property managers who maintained good relationships with tenants, coordinated necessary maintenance promptly, and provided detailed monthly reports that helped me understand the financial performance of each property. But more importantly, the arrangement provided emotional benefits that were even more valuable than the practical assistance. Having David and Jessica actively involved in managing the business interests that Richard and I had built together made me feel like our family legacy was being preserved and continued rather than simply maintained by a grieving widow who was struggling to keep everything from falling apart. During the summer and early fall of 2022, I began to feel like I was successfully navigating the transition from married partner to independent manager of significant business interests. The overwhelming grief was still present, but it was becoming more manageable as I developed new routines and support systems that allowed me to function effectively despite my loss. It was during this period of relative stability that Jessica first suggested I might want to consider relocating to be closer to family. "Margaret, I've been thinking about your living situation, and I wonder if you might be happier in Portland where you could see Tommy and Lucy more often," she said one afternoon as we reviewed the monthly property management reports. "The house in San Rafael is beautiful, but it's so large for one person, and you're 3 hours away from your grandchildren. Have you ever thought about finding a smaller place in Portland where you could be more involved in the children's daily lives?" The suggestion touched on something I had been thinking about, but hadn't fully articulated. The house that Richard and I had shared for over 20 years felt empty and lonely without him. Every room held memories that were both precious and painful, and the daily reminders of our shared life sometimes made the grief feel overwhelming rather than healing. More importantly, I missed having regular contact with Tommy and Lucy. During Richard's illness and the months after his death, my relationship with my grandchildren had become limited to phone calls and occasional visits that never felt long enough or frequent enough to maintain the close bond we had always shared. "I have thought about it," I admitted. "The house does feel too large now, and I would love to be closer to the children. But moving would be such a major undertaking, especially with everything else I'm trying to manage right now." "It would be a big transition," Jessica agreed. "But David and I could help with all the logistics. We could research neighborhoods, look at properties, and handle all the details of selling your current house and purchasing something in Portland. You wouldn't have to manage the process by yourself." The offer was generous and practical. Moving to Portland would allow me to see Tommy and Lucy regularly, while David and Jessica's assistance would make the transition manageable, despite the complexity of relocating extensive business operations and personal belongings. Over the following weeks, Jessica and I began researching Portland neighborhoods and looking at properties that might suit my needs. We visited condominiums in upscale neighborhoods, toured townhouses with low-maintenance landscaping, and explored retirement communities that offered social activities and support services for older residents. But every property we looked at felt like a compromise compared to the home that Richard and I had created together. The condominiums felt sterile and impersonal. The townhouses lacked the character and space that I was accustomed to. The retirement communities, while offering practical advantages, felt like giving up on independent living rather than transitioning to a new phase of life. "You know, Margaret," Jessica said after we had toured several properties that left me feeling uninspired, Maybe we're approaching this wrong. Instead of looking for the perfect existing property, maybe we should think about what would actually make you happy in Portland and then find a way to create that environment. What do you mean? Well, you and Richard always loved historic architecture and beautiful design. David is an architect who specializes in renovation and restoration. Instead of settling for something that doesn't feel right, maybe we should look for a property with good bones that David could help you renovate into exactly what you want. The suggestion sparked my interest in a way that the ready-made properties hadn't. Richard and I had always enjoyed renovation projects, and the idea of creating something beautiful and personal in Portland felt more appealing than simply purchasing someone else's vision of appropriate housing for a woman my age. Do you think David would be interested in taking on a project like that? I asked. Are you kidding? David would love the opportunity to work on a historic renovation with you. It would be a chance for him to use his architectural training on a personal project, while helping you create exactly the kind of living environment that would make you happy in Portland. The more we talked about the possibility of a renovation project, the more excited I became about the idea of moving to Portland. Instead of feeling like I was giving up the home that Richard and I had created together, I would be creating a new home that honored our shared love of beautiful architecture while establishing a new chapter of my life closer to my family. Jessica found the perfect property in November 2022, 847 Elm Street, a magnificent 1890s Victorian mansion in the Riverside Heights neighborhood that had been neglected for years, but retained all of its original architectural details. The house had 5 bedrooms, 4 bathrooms, a grand foyer with original stained glass, elaborate crown molding throughout, and a wraparound porch that gave it the kind of gracious presence that Richard and I had always admired in historic homes. The property was listed at $800,000, which seemed reasonable for a house of that size and architectural significance, even considering the extensive renovation work that would be required to restore it to its original grandeur. Margaret, this house has incredible potential, David said as we toured the property with the listing agent. The bones are absolutely solid and all the original details are intact. With the right renovation approach, this could be one of the most beautiful homes in Portland. I could see exactly what David meant. Despite years of deferred maintenance and outdated systems, the house retained an elegance and character that modern constructions rarely achieved. The proportions were perfect, the natural light was abundant, and the architectural details reflected the kind of craftsmanship that no longer existed in contemporary construction. How much do you think the renovation would cost? I asked. David walked through the house again, making notes about electrical systems, plumbing, foundation issues, and cosmetic improvements that would be needed to make the house fully functional and beautiful. For a complete restoration that brings everything up to modern standards while preserving the historic character, I'd estimate about $400,000, he said. That would include new electrical and plumbing systems, kitchen and bathroom renovations, refinishing all the hardwood floors, restoring the original windows, and updating the heating and cooling systems. $400,000 for renovation, plus $800,000 for the purchase price, would mean a total investment of $1.2 million for a fully restored Victorian mansion in one of Portland's most desirable neighborhoods. The investment seemed reasonable considering the quality of the property and the advantage of having David manage the renovation project with his professional expertise and personal investment in creating something beautiful for his mother. More importantly, the project would give me a reason to feel excited about the future for the first time since Richard's death. Instead of simply managing existing assets and trying to maintain what we had built together, I would be creating something new that honored our shared values while establishing a foundation for the next phase of my life. I think we should make an offer, I told Jessica and David after we had toured the property twice, and David had conducted a thorough assessment of the renovation requirements. The offer was accepted immediately, and by December 2022, I was the owner of a magnificent but neglected Victorian mansion that would become the center of an extensive renovation project managed by my son and daughter-in-law. The timing felt perfect. The property management company that David and Jessica had established was running smoothly, generating steady income while reducing my administrative responsibilities. The move to Portland would bring me closer to Tommy and Lucy while giving me an exciting project that would occupy my time and energy productively. Most importantly, the renovation project would strengthen my relationship with David and Jessica by giving us a shared goal that utilized their professional skills while creating something beautiful and meaningful for our family. What I didn't realize was that the decision to purchase and renovate 847 Elm Street would create the exact vulnerability that Jessica had been waiting for, an opportunity to position herself and David as essential to my well-being, while gaining access to assets and decision-making authority that she could eventually exploit for her own benefit. The grieving widow who thought she was making smart decisions about creating a new life in Portland was actually walking into a carefully orchestrated trap that would ultimately cost her far more than money. She was about to discover that the daughter-in-law who had been so helpful and supportive had her own agenda for the beautiful house that I was unknowingly purchasing for her benefit rather than my own. But in December 2022, as I signed the paperwork to purchase 847 Elm Street and began planning the renovation that would transform it into my new home, I felt hopeful about the future for the first time since Richard's death. I thought I was taking control of my life and making decisions that would bring me closer to the family I loved. I had no idea that I was actually funding my own systematic exclusion from that family while providing Jessica with the foundation for a lifestyle that she could never have afforded on her own. The house that I thought would bring us together would ultimately become the stage for the confrontation that would tear us apart. But Jessica had made one crucial miscalculation in her carefully orchestrated plan. She assumed that a grieving, 70-year-old widow would be easy to manipulate indefinitely, never suspecting that the woman she was exploiting had built a real estate empire through intelligence, strategic thinking, and an ability to recognize patterns of behavior that most people missed. The vulnerability that Jessica thought she could exploit forever was about to become the foundation for a lesson in consequences that would cost her everything she thought she had gained. The phone call that would change everything came on a rainy Thursday morning in March 2023, exactly 1 year after Richard's death. I was sitting in my temporary apartment in downtown Portland, a furnished 2-bedroom unit that I had rented while the renovation of 847 Elm Street was being completed, when Jessica called with what she described as urgent news that couldn't wait for our regularly scheduled weekly meeting. "Margaret, I need to talk to you about something important," Jessica said, her voice carrying a tone of crisis that immediately got my attention. "David and I have been looking at the renovation costs for the house, and we've discovered some problems that are going to require immediate attention and significant additional investment." The renovation project had been progressing steadily for 3 months, with David managing the work while Jessica handled the administrative coordination and vendor payments. The original budget of $400,000 had already increased to $475,000 due to discoveries of more extensive foundation and electrical issues than initially anticipated, but David had assured me that these were normal complications for a renovation of this scope and that the work was proceeding well within reasonable parameters. "What kind of problems are we talking about?" I asked, feeling a familiar knot of anxiety in my stomach that had become my default response to unexpected complications since Richard's death. "The structural engineer discovered some foundation issues that are more serious than we initially thought," Jessica explained. "There's also extensive water damage in the basement that's going to require complete replacement of the flooring system throughout the first floor. And the electrical system is going to need a complete overhaul. Apparently, the previous owners did some DIY work that isn't up to code and could be dangerous." Each problem she described sounded serious and expensive. Foundation repairs, structural work, and electrical systems weren't cosmetic issues that could be delayed or handled with less expensive alternatives. They were essential safety and structural integrity problems that had to be addressed immediately and properly. "How much additional money are we talking about?" I asked, though I was beginning to suspect that the answer would be substantial. "David has been getting estimates from contractors, and we're looking at probably another $200,000 to $250,000 to address all the structural and safety issues," Jessica said. "I know that's a lot more than we originally planned. But these aren't optional improvements. They're necessary repairs that have to be done before we can safely move forward with any of the cosmetic work." Another $250,000 would bring the total renovation costs to over $700,000. Combined with the $800,000 purchase price for a total investment of $1.5 million in a house that I had expected to cost $1.2 million. The additional expense was significant but not catastrophic given my overall financial resources, and Jessica was right that structural and safety issues couldn't be ignored or postponed. "Have you gotten second opinions on these estimates?" I asked. Sometimes contractors inflate prices when they know the client has significant financial resources. "David has been very careful about that," Jessica assured me. "He's gotten estimates from 3 different contractors for each type of work, and unfortunately, the prices are pretty consistent. These old houses can hide a lot of problems that only become apparent once you start serious renovation work." The explanation made sense. Historic renovation projects were notorious for uncovering hidden problems that required expensive solutions, and David's architectural training and professional reputation meant that he would be getting honest assessments from reputable contractors who wouldn't risk their relationship with him by providing inflated estimates. "When do these repairs need to be completed?" I asked. "The foundation work needs to start immediately," Jessica said. "The structural engineer says that some of the support beams are compromised, and we can't safely continue with other work until those issues are addressed. The contractors are available to start next week, but they need a commitment and partial payment to secure their schedule." The urgency created pressure to make a quick decision about a substantial financial commitment, but Jessica's explanation suggested that delaying the work could jeopardize the entire project and potentially create safety hazards. "How much money do they need up front?" I asked. "The contractors are asking for 50% payment to start the work, so we would need about $125,000 immediately to get the foundation and structural work underway," Jessica said. "I know it's a lot of money to commit on short notice, but David says that these contractors are the best in Portland for this type of historic renovation work, and if we don't secure their schedule now, we might have to wait several months to find other qualified contractors." $125,000 was a substantial amount of money, but it wasn't unreasonable as a partial payment for extensive structural work on a house of this size and architectural complexity. More importantly, the alternative of delaying the work and potentially losing access to qualified contractors could end up being more expensive and time-consuming in the long run. "Okay," I said. "I'll transfer the money to the renovation account today. But Jessica, I want detailed documentation of all these additional costs and clear explanations of what work is being done. This project is becoming much more expensive than we originally planned, and I need to understand exactly where my money is going." "Of course, Margaret. David and I completely understand your concern about the budget increases, and we'll make sure you have detailed documentation of every expense. We want you to feel completely confident that every dollar is being spent appropriately and necessary." After hanging up the phone, I sat in my temporary apartment feeling overwhelmed by the financial and logistical complications that seemed to multiply with every phase of the renovation project. What had started as an exciting opportunity to create a beautiful new home had become a source of constant stress and unexpected expenses that were testing my confidence in the decision to move to Portland. But I reminded myself that renovation projects always involved unforeseen complications, and that David's professional expertise and Jessica's administrative skills were ensuring that problems were being identified and addressed properly rather than ignored or handled inadequately. I transferred $125,000 from my primary investment, account to the renovation account that David and Jessica had established for managing project expenses, and I tried to focus on the long-term vision of living in a beautifully restored Victorian mansion where I could be close to Tommy and Lucy while enjoying the architectural details and craftsmanship that Richard and I had always appreciated. But over the following weeks, I began to notice patterns in the renovation project that raised questions about whether the work was being managed as efficiently and cost-effectively as I had been led to believe. The first red flag came when I decided to visit the house unannounced, to see the progress on the foundation work that had supposedly required immediate attention and substantial upfront payment. I drove to 847 Elm Street on a Tuesday afternoon, expecting to find contractors working on structural repairs and foundation improvements. Instead, I found the house completely empty, with no signs of active construction work and no evidence that any structural repairs had been started. The basement, where Jessica had described extensive water damage requiring complete flooring replacement, looked exactly the same as it had during my previous visits. Old and worn, but not showing the kind of extensive damage that would require emergency intervention. I called David immediately. "David, I'm at the house, and I don't see any contractors working on the foundation repairs that Jessica said were starting this week. What's going on with the structural work?" There was a pause before David responded. "Mom, there's been a delay with the permits. The contractors can't start the foundation work until the city approves the structural plans, and that process is taking longer than we expected." "How long have you known about the permit delay?" I asked. "We found out yesterday. I was going to call you this afternoon to explain the situation." "David, Jessica told me that the contractors needed immediate payment to secure their schedule and start work this week. If you knew there were permit delays, why did you ask for $125,000 up front?" Another pause. "The contractors still need the partial payment to hold their schedule for when the permits are approved. If we don't secure their commitment now, we'll lose their availability and have to find other contractors, which could delay the project for months." The explanation seemed reasonable but also convenient. Every complication seemed to require immediate payment, while actual work was delayed by bureaucratic processes that were supposedly beyond David and Jessica's control. "When do you expect the permits to be approved?" I asked. "The city says it could take anywhere from 2 to 6 weeks, David said. "Permit approval for historic properties is more complicated because they have to review all the structural changes to ensure they're consistent with historic preservation guidelines. 6 weeks seemed like a long time to hold contractors on retainer with substantial upfront payments. But David's explanation about historic preservation requirements made sense for a house as architecturally significant as 847 Elm Street. The second red flag came 2 weeks later when I received a call from Jessica requesting additional funds for what she described as an urgent plumbing emergency that had been discovered during the permit inspection process. "Margaret, I'm sorry to bother you, but we've had another unexpected problem come up with the house," Jessica said during what was becoming a familiar pattern of crisis phone calls. "The city inspector found some serious plumbing issues that have to be addressed before they'll approve any of the other permits." "What kind of plumbing issues?" I asked, feeling increasingly frustrated with the endless series of expensive problems that seemed to emerge every few weeks. "The main sewer line is damaged and needs to be completely replaced," Jessica explained. "The inspector says it's a health hazard that has to be fixed immediately, and it's going to require digging up the yard and part of the driveway to access the pipes." Sewer line replacement sounded like exactly the kind of expensive, unglamorous problem that could emerge during renovation of an old house. It was also the kind of problem that would require immediate attention from health and safety authorities. "How much is this going to cost?" I asked. "The plumbing contractor estimates about $35,000 for the complete sewer line replacement and restoration of the landscaping," Jessica said. "I know it's another unexpected expense, but it's not optional. The city won't issue any permits until this problem is resolved." $35,000 for sewer line work was expensive but not unreasonable for the scope of work Jessica was describing. More importantly, if the city inspector had identified it as a health hazard, it wasn't something that could be ignored or postponed. When does this work need to be completed? I asked. The plumbing contractor can start next week if we can provide a deposit, Jessica said. They're asking for $15,000 up front to order materials and secure their schedule. I authorized the $15,000 payment, but I also decided to drive by the house more frequently to monitor the progress of work that was supposedly requiring substantial ongoing investment. What I discovered during my unannounced visits over the following month was deeply concerning. Despite the payments for foundation work, structural repairs, and plumbing replacement, I rarely saw evidence of active construction work at the house. Occasionally, there would be a contractor's truck in the driveway or some materials delivered to the property, but the level of activity seemed inconsistent with the scope of work that was supposedly being performed and the amount of money that was being spent. More troubling, when I asked specific questions about the work progress during my weekly meetings with David and Jessica, their answers often seemed vague or inconsistent with what I was observing during my visits to the property. David, I drove by the house yesterday and I didn't see any signs of the sewer line work that we paid for last week, I said during one of our meetings. How is that project progressing? The plumbing contractor had to wait for city inspection of the excavation before they could proceed with installing the new pipes, David explained. They've done the excavation work, but now they're waiting for approval to continue. But when I had driven by the house, there was no evidence of excavation in the yard or driveway. The landscaping looked exactly the same as it had for weeks, with no signs that any digging or sewer line work had been started. The third red flag came in May 2023, when Jessica called with what she described as a significant problem that would require a fundamental change in our approach to the renovation project. Margaret, David, and I need to have a serious conversation with you about the renovation project, Jessica said during a phone call that immediately put me on alert because of her unusually formal tone. We've been working with the contractors and city officials, and we've discovered that the scope of work required to bring the house up to current safety and building codes is much more extensive than anyone initially realized. What do you mean? I asked, though I was beginning to dread the answer. The structural engineer has determined that the house needs what amounts to a complete reconstruction of the interior support systems, Jessica explained. The foundation issues are more serious than we thought. The electrical system has to be completely replaced rather than just updated, and there are significant problems with the load-bearing walls that will require major structural modifications. Each problem Jessica described sounded serious and expensive, but they also seemed to represent fundamental issues that a professional architectural assessment should have identified before we purchased the property and committed to the renovation project. David assured me that he had thoroughly evaluated the structural condition of the house before we made an offer, I said. How could all these major problems have been missed during his initial assessment? These are the kinds of hidden problems that only become apparent when you start serious construction work, Jessica said. David did the best assessment possible without actually tearing into the walls and floors, but some structural issues can't be identified until you start opening up the building systems. The explanation seemed reasonable, but also suspiciously convenient. Every few weeks brought new discoveries of expensive problems that supposedly couldn't have been anticipated during the initial evaluation, resulting in a steady stream of requests for additional funding. How much additional money are we talking about now? I asked. The contractor estimates that addressing all the structural issues will require about $300,000 beyond what we've already committed, Jessica said. I know that sounds like a lot, but it would result in a house that's completely rebuilt to modern standards while preserving all the historic architectural details. $300,000 would bring the total renovation cost to over $800,000. Combined with the $800,000 purchase price for a total investment of $1.6 million, the project that had started as a $1.2 million investment was approaching $1.6 million with no guarantee that additional problems wouldn't emerge once work was actually completed, Jessica, this project is becoming much more expensive than anything we originally discussed, I said. At this point, I'm wondering if we should consider selling the property and finding something that doesn't require such extensive renovation work. Margaret, I understand your frustration with the cost increases, but you have to consider that we've already invested over $600,000 in this property, Jessica said. If you sell now, you'll lose most of that investment because buyers won't pay full value for a house that's in the middle of an incomplete renovation project. The sunk cost argument was compelling. I had already committed substantial resources to the renovation project, and abandoning it now would mean losing most of that investment while still needing to find alternative housing in Portland. What are you recommending? I asked. David and... I think you should consider a different approach, Jessica said. Instead of continuing to manage this project as a renovation of your future home, you might want to think about it as a real estate investment that we complete and then sell for a profit. What do you mean? With the additional $300,000 investment, this house would be worth at least $2.2 million when the renovation is completed, Jessica explained. You could recover your entire investment plus a substantial profit and then use that money to purchase a smaller, more manageable property in Portland that doesn't require extensive renovation work. The investment strategy seemed logical. If the completed house would indeed be worth $2.2 million, a total investment of $1.6 million would generate a profit of $600,000 while eliminating the stress and complications of managing a complex renovation project. But if we're going to complete the renovation as an investment property rather than as my future home, who would manage the project and handle the eventual sale? I asked. David and I could continue managing the renovation project, and then we could handle the marketing and sale of the completed house, Jessica said. We have experience with the property now, we understand the work that's been done, and we know the Portland real estate market. The proposal seemed reasonable and would solve several problems simultaneously. I would be able to recover my investment while generating a substantial profit. The renovation project would be completed by people who understood its complexities, and I would be freed from the ongoing stress of managing construction work and dealing with endless complications and cost overruns. What kind of arrangement would you want for managing the completion and sale of the house? I asked. We would continue managing the renovation work as we have been, and then we would handle the sale with a standard real estate commission, Jessica said. The only difference is that instead of creating a home for you to live in, we would be creating an investment property for you to sell. The arrangement seemed fair and mutually beneficial. David and Jessica would continue earning income from managing the renovation project, while I would recover my investment, plus a substantial profit, without having to personally manage the remaining construction work. But there was one aspect of Jessica's proposal that would prove to be the most consequential decision of my entire relationship with my son and daughter-in-law. Margaret, there is one complication with treating this as an investment property rather than your personal residence, Jessica said. For tax and legal purposes, it would be simpler if the property were owned by someone who could claim Portland residency and manage it as a local real estate investment. What are you suggesting? David and I are Portland residents, and we're already managing the property and renovation work, Jessica explained. If you transferred ownership of the property to us, we could complete the renovation and handle the sale as local real estate investors, which would simplify the tax implications and make the entire process more efficient. Transfer ownership. Jessica was suggesting that I give David and Jessica legal ownership of the house that I had purchased and was renovating with my money, with the understanding that they would complete the renovation and then share the profits from the eventual sale. I'm not comfortable transferring ownership of a property that I've invested over $600,000 in, I said immediately. I completely understand your hesitation, Jessica said quickly. But it would only be a temporary arrangement for the purpose of completing and selling the property. We could establish a legal partnership agreement that guarantees your investment, recovery plus an agreed-upon profit-sharing arrangement. Jessica, I appreciate the business logic of your suggestion, but I'm not willing to transfer ownership of the property. I'm comfortable with continuing the current arrangement where I own the property and you manage the renovation work. Of course, Margaret. I just wanted to present all the options so you could make an informed decision. We'll continue with the current arrangement and make sure the renovation is completed successfully. At the time, I interpreted Jessica's suggestion about transferring property ownership as a misguided attempt to simplify a complex business arrangement. I thought she was trying to be helpful by proposing a structure that would reduce administrative complications, even though I wasn't comfortable with the legal implications of giving up ownership of such a valuable asset. What I didn't understand was that Jessica's proposal represented the first overt attempt to gain legal control over assets that she had been systematically positioning herself to exploit. The helpful daughter-in-law who had been providing valuable assistance with property management and renovation coordination was beginning to reveal her true agenda. But I still trusted David and Jessica enough to commit the additional $300,000 for completing the renovation work, believing that they were acting in my best interests while managing a complex project that was beyond my expertise to handle independently. The check I wrote for $300,000 in June 2023 would prove to be the final payment in a systematic financial exploitation that had been unfolding for over a year. But I wouldn't understand the true scope of what was happening until I found myself standing in that beautiful foyer 9 months later, listening to Jessica call me an outdated relic in the house that I had unknowingly purchased for her benefit. The inciting incident that had started with a phone call about urgent foundation repairs had actually been the beginning of the most expensive education of my life. I was about to learn that the people I trusted most were capable of betrayal that exceeded my worst fears, and that the house I thought would bring me closer to my family was actually the instrument of my systematic exclusion from their lives. But Jessica had made a fatal error in her calculations. She assumed that a grieving widow would remain vulnerable and manageable indefinitely. She never suspected that the woman she was manipulating had spent decades developing the strategic thinking and legal expertise that would ultimately destroy everything she thought she had gained. The Relic was about to show Jessica Martinez Walsh exactly what happened when you mistake generosity for weakness and confuse grief for stupidity. The moment Jessica called me an outdated relic who needs to stay in her lane while standing in the foyer of 847 Elm Street, everything crystallized with startling clarity. The helpful daughter-in-law who had spent 18 months positioning herself as my emotional support and business partner had just revealed her true opinion of the woman whose money had made her comfortable lifestyle possible. But what Jessica didn't know, as she stood there in her righteous indignation, was that the relic she was dismissing had been documenting every suspicious transaction, recording conversations, and building a legal case that would strip away everything she thought she owned. As I left the house that October Sunday evening, ignoring David's desperate attempts to apologize for his wife's behavior and Jessica's continued rant about boundaries and respect, I felt something shift inside me that was more powerful than hurt or anger. I felt the cold, calculating fury of a woman who had finally understood the scope of the betrayal she had been funding for over a year. The first call I made from my car was to Patricia Morrison, my estate planning attorney and longtime friend, who had been handling my legal affairs since Richard's death. "Patricia, it's Margaret. I need to see you first thing Monday morning. I think I've been the victim of a sophisticated financial fraud, and I need to know exactly what my legal options are." "Margaret, what's happened?" "I'll explain everything when I see you, but I need you to prepare for the possibility that I'm going to need to take immediate legal action to recover assets that have been obtained through deception and manipulation." My second call was to Rebecca Chen, a forensic accountant who specialized in financial fraud cases, and whom Patricia had recommended months earlier when I first began having concerns about the renovation project expenses. "Rebecca, this is Margaret Walsh. Patricia Morrison referred me to you several months ago. I need a complete forensic audit of all financial transactions related to a property renovation project and property management business that I believe has been used to defraud me of substantial assets. Mrs. Walsh, what's the scope of the potential fraud we're looking at? Potentially over $1 million in fraudulent or misrepresented expenses, plus systematic theft from property management accounts over an 18-month period. Mrs. Walsh, I can meet with you Tuesday morning. Bring every document, bank statement, and record you have related to these transactions. We'll need to move quickly if you want to maximize your recovery options. My third call was to Michael Torres, a private investigator who specialized in family financial crimes and whom I had consulted briefly when I first began suspecting that Jessica and David were not being completely honest about the renovation expenses. Michael, it's Margaret Walsh. I need you to conduct immediate surveillance on 847 Elm Street in Portland and document exactly what construction work, if any, is actually being performed at that property. I also need you to investigate the business, activities of Walsh Property Management LLC, and determine whether the properties they claim to be managing are actually generating the rental income they've been reporting to me. Mrs. Walsh, how quickly do you need this information? I need preliminary results within 48 hours and a complete report within 1 week. I suspect that I've been systematically defrauded by family members, and I need evidence to support legal action. By Monday morning, I had assembled a team of professionals who would help me understand the full scope of what had been done to me and develop a strategy for recovering my assets while ensuring that David and Jessica faced appropriate consequences for their betrayal. The meeting with Patricia Morrison was devastating, but also clarifying. As I explained the pattern of financial requests, the renovation project complications, and the systematic exclusion from family activities that had coincided with my increasing financial support, Patricia's expression grew increasingly grim. Margaret, what you're describing sounds like textbook elder financial abuse combined with systematic family manipulation, she said. The pattern of creating false crises to justify immediate financial transfers, the gradual assumption of control over your assets and decision-making, the isolation from other family members. These are classic tactics used to exploit elderly people who have significant financial resources. But David is my son, I said. How could he participate in systematically defrauding his own mother? Financial elder abuse by family members is unfortunately more common than most people realize, Patricia explained. Adult children often convince themselves that they're entitled to their parents' assets, or that they're doing their parents a favor by taking control of financial decisions. In many cases, they genuinely believe they're acting in their parents' best interests, while simultaneously benefiting financially from their control. Patricia reviewed the legal documents related to my property purchases, the property management agreements, and the renovation contracts that David and Jessica had prepared. Margaret, there are several concerning elements in these agreements, she said, after studying the paperwork for over an hour. The property management contract gives David and Jessica unusually broad authority over your rental properties, including the ability to make expenditures and enter into contracts without your specific approval. The renovation contracts are structured in ways that make it difficult to verify whether the work is actually being performed or whether the costs are reasonable. What are my legal options? If we can demonstrate that you were defrauded through misrepresentation, or that David and Jessica breached their fiduciary duties as your property managers, we can pursue both civil litigation to recover your losses and potentially criminal charges for theft and elder abuse, Patricia explained. But we'll need substantial evidence to prove that their actions were deliberately deceptive rather than merely incompetent. The meeting with Rebecca Chen, the forensic accountant, was even more revealing. Rebecca had spent 2 days reviewing every financial transaction related to the property management business and the renovation project, and her preliminary findings were shocking. Mrs. Walsh, based on my analysis of the financial records you've provided, there are significant discrepancies between the rental income that should have been generated by your properties and the amounts that were actually deposited into your accounts, Rebecca said as she presented spreadsheets documenting 18 months of financial activity. What kind of discrepancies? Walsh Property Management was collecting approximately $32,000 per month in rental income from your properties, but they were only depositing about $21,000 per month into your account after deducting their management fees and claimed expenses, Rebecca explained. The difference of $11,000 per month represents nearly $200,000 over the 18 months they've been managing your properties. $200,000 in missing rental income was a substantial theft, but it was only the beginning of what Rebecca had discovered. The renovation project presents even more serious concerns, she continued. I've analyzed the payments you made for various contractors and construction work, and I can't find evidence that most of the work was actually performed or that the contractors you supposedly paid actually exist. What do you mean? For example, you paid $125,000 for emergency foundation work in March 2023, Rebecca said, showing me copies of the checks and contracts. But the contractor listed on the invoices doesn't have a business license in Oregon, and there's no evidence that any foundation work was performed at the property during that time period. Rebecca had identified similar problems with virtually every major expense related to the renovation project. The plumbing contractor who was supposedly paid $35,000 for sewer line replacement had no record of permits or inspections for that type of work at 847 Elm Street. The electrical contractor who had received $45,000 for rewiring the house had never pulled electrical permits for the property. The structural engineer who had supposedly identified critical safety issues had no record of conducting an inspection at the address. Mrs. Walsh, based on my analysis, I believe that most of the renovation expenses you've paid were for work that was never performed, Rebecca said. The total amount of fraudulent renovation charges appears to be approximately $650,000. $650,000 in fraudulent renovation charges, plus $200,000 in stolen rental income, meant that David and Jessica had defrauded me of nearly $850,000 over 18 months while positioning themselves as my helpful supporters and business partners. But the most devastating revelation came when Rebecca showed me what David and Jessica had actually done with my money. Mrs. Walsh, I've traced the financial flows from your payments to David and Jessica's personal and business accounts, she said, presenting bank records that Michael Torres had obtained through his investigation. Rather than paying legitimate contractors for renovation work, they were transferring your money directly into their personal accounts and using it to fund their lifestyle and personal investments. The bank records showed that David and Jessica had used my money to pay off their credit card debts, make payments on expensive cars, take luxury vacations, and even make investments in other real estate properties that they owned personally. They were literally using your money to build their own wealth while telling you that it was being spent on your renovation project, Rebecca explained. This isn't just theft. It's a sophisticated investment fraud that they've been perpetrating for over a year. Michael Torres's investigation provided the final pieces of the puzzle. His surveillance of 847 Elm Street confirmed that virtually no construction work had been performed at the property since I purchased it in December 2022. The house remained in essentially the same condition as when I bought it, despite my having paid over $700,000 for supposed renovation work. Mrs. Walsh, I've been monitoring the property for a week, and I've seen no contractors, no construction equipment, and no signs of active renovation work, Michael reported. I've also confirmed that most of the contractors listed on your invoices either don't exist or have no record of working at this address. But Michael's most significant discovery was what David and Jessica had actually been planning for 847 Elm Street. Mrs. Walsh, I've found evidence that David and Jessica have been marketing 847 Elm Street as their own personal residence, he said, showing me real estate listings and social media posts that Jessica had created. They've been telling people that they recently purchased a historic Victorian mansion in Riverside Heights and have been hosting social events at the property as if they were the owners. Jessica had been using my house as the foundation for the social status and lifestyle that she had always wanted, hosting dinner parties for Portland's architectural and design community, while presenting herself as the owner of one of the city's most beautiful historic homes. "There's something else, Mrs. Walsh," Michael continued. "I've found evidence that David and Jessica were planning to legally claim ownership of the property through adverse possession laws, arguing that they had been managing and maintaining it while you were an absentee owner who had abandoned your interest in the property. Adverse possession. They were planning to literally steal my house by claiming that I had abandoned it, and that their occupation and management of the property gave them legal ownership rights. The scope of the betrayal was breathtaking. David and Jessica hadn't just been stealing my money. They had been systematically positioning themselves to claim ownership of the house I had purchased while using my financial resources to fund their social climbing and lifestyle ambitions. But they had made one crucial mistake in their elaborate scheme. They had underestimated the woman they were defrauding. Patricia Morrison spent the next week preparing a comprehensive legal strategy that would not only recover my stolen assets, but ensure that David and Jessica faced serious consequences for their actions. "Margaret, we're going to pursue this case on multiple fronts," she explained during our strategy meeting. "Civil litigation to recover your financial losses, criminal charges for elder financial abuse and theft, and immediate legal action to reclaim possession of your property." The first step was obtaining an emergency court order that would freeze all of David and Jessica's assets and prevent them from transferring or hiding any property that they had purchased with my stolen money. We're also going to seek an immediate restraining order that will prevent David and Jessica from accessing 847 Elm Street or any of your other properties, Patricia said. "They've been treating your house as their personal residence, but they're about to discover that they have no legal right to be there." The civil lawsuit we filed sought damages of $850,000 plus punitive damages and attorney's fees. But more importantly, it included detailed documentation of every fraudulent transaction and a complete timeline of how David and Jessica had systematically exploited my grief and trust to steal nearly $1 million. The criminal charges were even more serious. The district attorney's office agreed to prosecute David and Jessica for elder financial abuse, theft in the first degree, and conspiracy to commit fraud, charges that carried potential prison sentences of up to 10 years. But I wanted more than just financial recovery and legal consequences. I wanted David and Jessica to face the kind of public humiliation and social embarrassment that would match the private humiliation they had subjected me to for 18 months. The opportunity for that kind of justice came sooner than I expected. Jessica had planned a housewarming party for November 15, 2023, an elaborate social event at 847 Elm Street, where she intended to formally present herself as the owner of one of Portland's most prestigious historic homes. She had invited over 100 people from Portland's architectural, design, and social community, including many of David's professional colleagues and Jessica's social media contacts who had been following her home renovation journey online. The invitations, which I obtained through Michael Torres's investigation, described the event as Jessica and David's celebration of our beautiful Victorian home renovation, and included professional photographs of the house's elegant interior spaces. What Jessica didn't know was that I had legal ownership of every square foot of the property where she was planning to host her social triumph, and that I was about to reclaim possession of my house in the most public and devastating way possible. On the morning of November 15th, Patricia Morrison and I arrived at 847 Elm Street with the Sheriff's Department and the court orders that gave me immediate possession of my property and required David and Jessica to vacate the premises immediately. Mrs. Walsh has legal ownership of this property, and Mr. and Mrs. Whitfield are no longer authorized to occupy or use the premises, the sheriff explained to David and Jessica as they stood in the foyer, where Jessica had called me a Relic 6 weeks earlier. "This is impossible," Jessica said, her face white with shock. We have legal agreements with Margaret for managing this property. Ma'am, those agreements have been terminated due to evidence of fraud and breach of fiduciary duty. The sheriff replied. You need to remove your personal belongings and vacate the property immediately. David looked stunned and confused, as if he couldn't quite process what was happening. Mom, what is this about? Can't we discuss this as a family? I looked at my son, the man I had raised with love and integrity, who had apparently spent 18 months participating in a scheme to defraud his own mother, and felt a sadness that was deeper than anger. David, the time for family discussions ended when you and Jessica decided to steal nearly $1 million from me while pretending to be helpful and supportive, I said. You've made your choices, and now you'll face the consequences. Mom, we weren't stealing from you, David said desperately. We were managing your investments and helping you with projects that were too complicated for you to handle alone. David, you billed me $650,000 for renovation work that was never performed, I replied. You stole $200,000 in rental income from properties that I own. You were planning to claim legal ownership of this house through adverse possession. These aren't management decisions, they're felony crimes. The sheriff gave David and Jessica 30 minutes to remove their personal belongings before the property would be secured and they would be barred from returning without legal authorization. They gathered their clothes, personal items, and the expensive furnishings they had purchased with my stolen money. I walked through the house that I had unknowingly bought for their benefit. The rooms were beautifully furnished and decorated, but none of the structural work that I had paid for had actually been completed. The house was essentially the same as when I had purchased it 10 months earlier, except that David and Jessica had been living in it as if it were their own. The housewarming party that evening was unlike anything Jessica had planned. Instead of celebrating her social triumph as the owner of a prestigious historic home, she had to call over 100 guests to explain that the party was canceled due to unexpected legal complications. But the most satisfying aspect of my reclaiming, 847 Elm Street, wasn't the financial recovery or even the legal consequences that David and Jessica would face. It was the knowledge that I had refused to be dismissed, discarded, or forgotten by people who had mistaken my grief for weakness and my generosity for stupidity. The civil lawsuit was settled 6 months later for the full amount of my losses, plus additional damages. David and Jessica were required to repay $850,000, forfeit their interests in Walsh Property Management LLC, and transfer ownership of several assets they had purchased with my stolen money. The criminal case resulted in felony convictions for both David and Jessica. David was sentenced to 3 years probation and 200 hours of community service, while Jessica received 18 months in prison, followed by 3 years probation. The judge specifically noted that elder financial abuse was a serious crime that destroyed families and violated the most basic obligations of trust and care. But perhaps the most significant consequence was the complete destruction of the social status and lifestyle that Jessica had been so desperate to achieve. The criminal convictions and public exposure of their fraud ended David's architectural career and destroyed Jessica's social media presence and community reputation. The people who had admired their beautiful home and sophisticated lifestyle learned that it had all been built on money stolen from an elderly widow. 6 months after reclaiming my house, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. Instead of selling 847 Elm Street or moving into it as my personal residence, I decided to donate the property to the Portland Housing Authority to be used as affordable housing for elderly women who had been victims of financial abuse. This house was purchased with money that was meant to provide me with a beautiful home where I could be close to my grandchildren, I explained to the Housing Authority director. Since that dream was destroyed by the people who were supposed to help me achieve it, I want the house to provide homes for other women who have faced similar betrayals and need support rebuilding their lives. The Margaret Walsh House for Women opened in September 2024, providing affordable housing and support services for elderly women who had been victims of financial abuse. The beautiful Victorian mansion that Jessica had wanted to use as the foundation for her social status became a symbol of recovery and empowerment for women who had been dismissed and discarded by their own families. As for my relationship with Tommy and Lucy, it took time to rebuild the trust that had been damaged by their parents' manipulation and lies. But children are resilient and loving, and once they understood that their grandmother had never stopped wanting to be part of their lives, our relationship began to heal. Tommy, now 10 years old, spends summers with me at my new home in Portland, Hawaii. Modest but comfortable townhouse that I purchased with my own money and that no one can take away from me. Lucy, now 8, has started taking piano lessons, and we spend hours together practicing and talking about her dreams for the future. David has made attempts to repair our relationship, and while I don't think we'll ever return to the closeness we once shared, I've learned that forgiveness doesn't require trust, and that love doesn't require enabling harmful behavior. As for Jessica, I haven't spoken to her since the day I reclaimed my house. The woman who called me an outdated relic learned that some relics are more valuable and more dangerous than they appear. She discovered that dismissing someone based on age and grief is one of the most expensive mistakes a person can make. Thor. Moral of this story isn't about money or revenge. It's about the importance of recognizing your own worth and refusing to accept treatment that diminishes your dignity, even when that treatment comes from people you love. It's about understanding that true strength sometimes requires saying no to family members who mistake your generosity for weakness. I'm 71 years old now, and I've learned that being a relic means being something valuable, something that has survived challenges and maintained its worth despite attempts to dismiss or destroy it. Relics are preserved because they have historical significance and enduring value. The next time someone tries to dismiss you as outdated or irrelevant, remind them that relics are kept in museums because they're priceless, not because they're worthless. And sometimes the best way to honor your own value is to ensure that people who underestimate you learn exactly how much their mistake cost them. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.